This is Clark Fisher. This is my problem stating PowerPoint, and this is about oyster conservation within the Chesapeake Bay. Just so you know, my camera's over here, but my screen's like right here. So if you see me like looking this way, that's why. Uh, so to begin, we have problem framing, our ecological harm within the Chesapeake Bay. So my geographic boundary that I've chosen is this watershed here, the Chesapeake Bay watershed, because I've done research in here before, and I've also done conservation efforts with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which will appear a lot in this slideshow. And I also, I don't know, I live around there. This problem affects me directly, and I'm willing to help. And this watershed is where I've spent most of my life, and I've chosen it as the area because it's what I'm talking about affects the most, the population of oysters. It affects this area specifically. So the damages that a lack of oysters can cause uh, to this watershed is the unclean water. That's my big one. The water quality has gone down in Virginia Beach and other surrounding places like it pretty significantly in the past couple of years. Not even just past couple of years, in the past many years, ever since the overfarming and the disease hit the oyster population. And the overfarming happened a while ago, like 1880s. So it's been on a decline ever since then. It's a lack of habitats, which obviously is going to hurt the surrounding wildlife pretty badly. And obviously the economic impact. The I know that oysters used to be a large part of Virginia, uh, and honestly the U.S.'s economic gain, and it has gone down significantly ever since the population has gone down. And so our goal is to kind of get that population back up so that the economic proceedings can continue. The habitat is restored so that the overall wildlife of the area is restored to how it was, and the water can become more clean for any use you can think of. And so the causes, historic overfarming, disease, and habitat loss. And we will go into more of that later. And all of this is from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So next, I have two graphs here. So this data, the Rowan Lockwood and Roger Mann, this is the population density of oysters in comparison to what we were able to find using the archaeological history of oysters. And so before human interaction, uh, or not before human interaction, it should be before British settling American colonization practices. You can see the density of the oysters is massively larger than the frequency nowadays. The top one, this gray one, is the frequency nowadays. The black one is the frequency of the oyster population before uh, colonistic practices, I'll call them. And this is by the National Library of Medicine. It's a peer-reviewed article. It is trusted, and you can see here in this quote in the bottom right, I say that the Chesapeake Bay is arguably the most studied large body of water on Earth, and that is by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And this Chesapeake Bay Foundation just is the end all be all. They share all their information about the studies that they do about the Chesapeake Bay. They're the leading researchers, preventers, activists within this field, and Rowan Lockwood and Roger Mann's information here is derived from the information that is collected by things such as the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So why this time frame? I chose this graph because it shows. I should probably stop pointing. I don't know where my webcam is going to end up, but this graph, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, is arguably the most studied large body of water on the Earth. Again, and this has been since the early 1900s. Uh, so we started at 1880 because this is when the oyster population was at its peak. This is before uh, steamboats were invented, and that was the first major damage because they would dredge out large populations of oysters in order to make room for their boats and prevent damages to their boats. And so you can see here I have labeled where the over farming began. And that's the first massive decline in population that we see. Uh, I mean, it was just one of our main resources for money making, and it was over farmed. And then you can see around the 1930s to the 1960s, we kind of leveled out and we kind of figured it out. And there's a little bit drop in the 1960s, but we understood that we were farming too much and we put regulations in place. And then the disease aspect broke out in the 1985, some 1980s. And when this disease outbreak happened, another sharp cut in the population of the oysters in the Chesapeake Bay happened. And so that's why this pattern is visible. Uh, it's a pretty unique pattern because it's two different events that are happening to this conservation effort, and so the two big causes are visible within the graph. So causal factors. So historic overfarming, as mentioned, dredges used so ships coming over from England weren't harmed by large clusters of oysters. And then in the early 1900s, 20 million bushels were harvested a year. It was a large portion of Virginia income, a very large portion of the United States income. And as early as the 1970s, contributed about $207 million a year to the Virginia economy. So overfarming happened, destroyed the majority of oysters that were within the Chesapeake Bay for a multitude of reasons. And then we have disease. So MSX is a parasite brought over from the importation of coastal Asia oysters. So oysters on the other side of the Pacific Ocean were immune to this one set of parasite and a disease associated with that parasite. And then by shady American business practices, specifically the illegal planting of these Asian oysters in order to cover up the fact that they had overharvested and broke the law. So they were trying to cover it up by importing these oysters to fix their mistake. It didn't work, and this parasite and disease known as MSX were introduced to the population. And the resistance to this disease is genetically inherited, and the non-invasive species of oyster native to the Chesapeake Bay did not have it, and so it's been a struggle to keep the oysters alive long enough for them to develop and put this genetically inherited resistance into the gene pool. And so both of these, as shown in the graph before, have caused massive detriment to the population. So here I am comparing my problem to a popular one, and I decided to go with that one video that we watched and wrote about, the animal feedlot pollution, and then that compared to my lack of oyster population issue. So we'll start with solubility. For the animal feedlot, I said that government regulation is possible, and with government regulation comes a change in farming practices. And this change in farming practices will allow basically just less pollution if you put fines or maybe just regulations in general, legalities around the amount of animals you can have in a place, the amount of fertilizer you're allowed to use in a certain place, the amount of runoff you're allowed to have. Any sort of regulation on this could help solve the solution. And it's similar to my problem, the oyster population, because government regulation was put in place and it kind of worked for a while before that disease hit, but it doesn't work enough anymore now that MSX has been introduced into the population. And it honestly didn't work a crazy amount before then, so we need a better solution than government regulation. And so then it comes to disease prevention. We tried to stop the bringing in of invasive species. It was illegal when they did it, and this illegal activity just bypass the laws, and the reason it was illegal is because it brought in this disease. So we had preventative measures that didn't work. So now what we need to do is figure out a solution to remove this disease from the population, and we don't know how to yet, if ever. And so, for complexity for the animal feedlot pollution, it's pretty easy to conceptualize. Most people know about or have learned about runoff, uh, but there is a lack of perceived ability to help with the feedlot pollution because, for the example that we used in class and in that take-home activity, the chicken market would suffer if these regulations were put in place, and many people see that as a government problem and or a farming problem, and they're not going to change their consuming habits of chicken for this cause. And so there's kind of a lack of perceived ability to help there. And it's kind of similar with the oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay. It's easy to conceptualize. It's easy. More oysters, cleaner water, less oysters, dirty water bad. Pretty easy. However, there is this lack of perceived ability to help, but I won't say it's as bad as the feedlot pollution because there actually has been a lot of money and a lot of cleanup efforts to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and there is some help that is happening, and there are some things that are working, which is more than I can say for the animal feedlot baseline. However, it's been turning out over years, over the past few years, that the solutions that we've come up with aren't working as well as we thought they would. And then let's move on to scale. Uh, so the animal feedlot pollution is massive. It spans the entire US because feedlots are everywhere, farming is everywhere. And it also spans most of the globe, anywhere where there are a lot of farm animals and water nearby. So their waste is running off into this water. It's a very, very global, not unique to the US problem that needs a solution that is global as well. And that's different than the scale of the lack of oyster population because this lack of oyster population and this disease is specific to the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake Bay watershed and what it affects. And inland states won't be affected by this as much because they don't have connection to the water, they don't have access to the beach. It's less likely that they know about this. Uh, and it's just in this East Coast Chesapeake Bay watershed. However, the solutions that could be applied, like any sort of sustainable oyster harvesting practices or any sort of disease prevention solutions established for oysters, could be applied to other watersheds around the US, especially ones that contain oysters. Uh, but it's still a much smaller scale than the animal feedlot pollution. And then we have my, as you described it, super preliminary policy tool options, basically a brainstorm of possible policy actions that could be taken in order to solve this issue. So the first one I have is regulation of farming practices. I talked about this a little bit earlier. They're already in place. There's only about 1,000 oyster harvesting license in Virginia, uh, and that already is a pretty large regulation on what's going on here, and it's not working very well. It's working, but not to the efficiency level that we want it. So I'd say that this is possible. It is a good policy solution, but it's not the only one we need in place. But right now, it's keeping these harsh regulations are keeping the oyster population alive, which I'll talk about a little bit later on the slide. It's kind of the goal. It's We're kind of in a stage of keep the oysters here and enough so that they can rebound so that they have time to acclimate to these diseases. And so the next one is regulation on invasive species. There's already pretty hefty regulations on invasive species, but they got through. And so it worked until individuals broke the law for profit. So more intense regulation I could see as a possible solution to this. However, it's kind of like too little, too late, it feels like. And although it's necessary, it needs to be part of the puzzle. I won't say it's the largest part because we shouldn't allow these diseases to come into our environment, and we shouldn't allow these invasive species to be able to bring them. But right now, we need to focus on removing the disease from them rather than preventing future disease, although both are important. So my next one, which is one of my more probable solutions, is money grants to scientists and researchers working in this field to eliminate and figure out a cure for the MXS virus and parasite. And I think this would work the best because obviously I was saying we need a cure to this disease that is running rampant. Uh, but also it will provide a monetary incentive, which usually works, and any research from this and discoveries from this will be able to be put forward into future diseases that affect the Chesapeake Bay and the oyster population. And our next one is conservation and recycling organizations, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and organization. There's a couple of them. They're huge. Most people in Virginia know about them, especially coastal Virginia. You're aware of these foundations just due to public schooling, usually. Uh, so, what conservation and recycling efforts do is they're kind of keeping this population alive long enough to adapt to diseases. It's a temporary solution, but if people come together, and I should add this into the information spreading, there are these practices like shell recycling, oyster farming, and cleanup efforts. Shell recycling is just after you eat oysters, throw the shells back into the ocean, or better yet, throw the shells back into the specified areas so that they can be reclaimed by the environment and used as homes for future oysters and future biodiverse life forms within the bay. Oyster farming is for people in Virginia Beach and, well, anywhere on the Chesapeake Bay watershed area that are that own property that have docks and things of that nature that reach out into the water. You can actually set up little oyster farms, and then they will build up, and they'll build up into large patches of oyster, and then you can get those oysters transported to the areas that need them, and then they will grow again. And so it's just something on the side that you can do that really helps because taking it's giving oysters more space to grow, basically. And it's kind of treating it like a garden, like you plant a tree in your garden and then you move it back to the forest, kind of. And then the cleanup efforts. Many people have done cleanup efforts in support of the Chesapeake Bay, and it just kind of cut some of the load off of the oysters because there's a statistic that oysters used to be able to clean the entire Chesapeake Bay in 1 week, and now it takes them 300 days. So any sort of help that we can do to help clean the Chesapeake Bay, keep it cleaner, more biodiverse, it will lead to a better habitat and thus more oysters. I think that yeah. And then I'll explain my works cited here and the sites that I decided to use. So this first one is from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the history of Chesapeake Bay cleanup efforts. This one I used uh, for what did I use? It is Chesapeake Bay cleanup efforts. That's right. This is this graph. My figure one oyster harvest in Chesapeake Bay graph. That one is used in conjunction with the other information that I found to describe the current population of oysters and the change in time. And I should mention this graph, the figure one oyster harvest in Chesapeake Bay. It's not the amount of oysters, it's the amount of oyster harvests. However, it still does describe and show the relation because oyster harvests have been proportional to the number of oysters in the bay. So while it gets close to zero here in 2000, 2008, that's not an exact representation of the total number of uh, oyster population. It is, however, a very accurate description of the trend that happened with the overfarming and the disease outbreak. So if you want the actual population, you just raise this graph up a little bit. But this one over here, the oyster population on the left, that is accurate. So that one I have Chesapeake Bay program, which is different than the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Uh, so I was researching just, Chesapeake Bay, and I was looking for graphs and information, and these two came up. And obviously, uh, my fourth source here is also Chesapeake Bay Foundation reports. They're my main source because they're the largest and most prominent and most televised researcher in this field, and it's the most researched body of water, definitely in the US. And because of that, it's just the one organization that houses all this research is going to be my main source. And then I have Lockwood, Rowan, and Mann. They wrote for a William and Mary scholarly article, and that got picked up by the National Library of Medicine. It's a peer-reviewed article, and it uses data driven by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the Chesapeake Bay uh, program. And this data gathered is what supports all of their research. So all these are trusted for me. They're leading government organizations within this field. They are information derived and tested, peer reviewed from the leading organization within this field. And that is my presentation. Thank you.